Clara Mitchell's breath hitched as she stared at the loaves scattered across the dirt floor. Her hands shook, her heart racing. 3 years of widowhood, 3 years of fighting to keep the bakery open. And just like that, it was all ruined. 12 perfect loaves of bread. Ruined. The sweat on her brow felt like fire in the summer heat, but nothing burned like the shame creeping through her chest. It wasn't just bread. It was her life, the product of every early morning, every sleepless night. And then this man, this stranger, had come through the door, without care, without thought, and knocked it all down. Clara's fists tightened, nails digging into her palms, and without thinking she shouted, "You ruined everything!" The man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his dusty hat perched low over his brow. He looked at her, eyes steady, unreadable. He was everything Clara resented, everything that had been taken from her. A life she couldn't reach, a future beyond her grasp. He stepped toward the broken loaves, then back to her, his face set, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry," he said, the words slow and heavy, but there was something about him that made Clara's anger bubble up even more. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like he was used to fixing things with money. "Let me pay for them." Clara laughed, though it was bitter, a sharp sound that bounced off the walls. "I don't want your money," she spat. "I want you to get out. Get out of my shop." He didn't move. Instead, he watched her with eyes that seemed to study her every movement, every reaction. His gaze lingered on her clenched fists and then down to the bread, broken as if it didn't matter. "I said leave," Clara repeated, her voice quieter now but filled with more venom. She took a step toward him, her feet heavy in the dust that lined the shop floor. "I didn't mean to," he started, but Clara cut him off, her voice rising. "You men are all the same," she said. "You barged in here, didn't even bother to open the door properly. You can't even see beyond your own damn needs, can you? You think the world revolves around you, don't you?" Quote. The man's amber eyes flickered, a hint of something, guilt, passing through them. He opened his mouth again, but Clara wasn't having it. "I buried my husband 3 years ago," she went on, her voice thickening with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "And every single day I've been fighting just to keep my daughter fed, to keep this roof over our heads. I don't have time for men who don't know how to open a door without destroying everything in their path. So if you're done with your sorry, then get out." The man stayed silent, a muscle in his jaw twitching as if he was trying to find the right words. He finally nodded, slowly. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, tipping his hat to her. His voice had softened. "I understand. I'm real sorry for the trouble." Clara's breath came faster. She wasn't sure if it was from anger or frustration or just the exhaustion of it all. But she watched as he left, his long legs carrying him out the door without another word. And then, when the door shut behind him, when she was left alone in the quiet of the shop with the ruins of her morning's work, Clara felt it. The emptiness, the weight of what she had said. Her hands shook. Her heart still pounded, but now it wasn't with rage. It was with something else. Regret. The kind of regret she'd been running from for 3 years. The kind that settled in her chest like a stone she couldn't lift. She stared at the door, unable to move, couldn't move. As if the moment he left had sealed something inside her. What had she done? Clara pressed her hands to her face and took a deep breath. There was work to do, more bread to bake, a daughter to care for. A life to keep moving forward, despite everything that had tried to break it. But as she began to clean up the mess, as she started kneading the dough again, she couldn't stop thinking about those amber eyes, the ones that had seemed to understand. He hadn't argued. He hadn't lashed out. He'd just listened. And that made her heart ache more than the bread ever could. The days that followed passed in a haze for Clara. Each morning she woke before the sun to mix dough by lamplight, her hands working the bread as though it was the only thing she could still control. Every day she forced herself to keep moving, to keep her mind occupied, to keep the ghosts of her past locked away. The town of Copper Springs continued on around her, indifferent to her personal turmoil. The usual sounds of the bustling street outside her bakery filled her mornings. Horses trotting by, the calls of the town's merchants setting up shop, the chatter of neighbors passing each other on their way to work. But Clara could hardly hear them over the thudding in her own chest. Her thoughts kept drifting back to that man, Jackson Callahan, the cowboy who had ruined her morning and somehow made her feel seen, even though she wanted nothing of it. Even now, as she worked, she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes. The way they had looked at her with something like understanding. Something that made her feel like, maybe, just maybe, he saw her for who she really was, behind the bitterness, the exhaustion, and the walls she had built so high. Clara hated the way he'd made her feel. She didn't want help. She didn't want his apologies, his money, or his sympathy. She just wanted to survive, alone if she had to. But in the quiet moments when she wasn't busy with flour and dough, she found herself wondering what he was doing, who he was, and why he seemed different from the other men who had passed through her life. She should have hated him. She should have resented him for being the kind of man who could sweep through life unscathed, for having everything she didn't. But there was something in the way he'd tipped his hat, in the quiet sincerity of his apology, that made her question everything. It was late afternoon when Ruth Jennings burst into the bakery, her usual sense of urgency in tow. "Clara, you will not believe who I just saw," Ruth said, her voice thick with gossip. Clara didn't look up from her bread-making, though she couldn't help the way her pulse quickened at the sound of Ruth's tone. "Who?" "Jackson Callahan," Ruth said dramatically, throwing herself into the nearest chair. "And do you know what he was doing?" Clara's hands stilled in the dough, her heart suddenly louder in her ears. She didn't want to know, she really didn't, but her curiosity was already stirring. She forced herself to speak casually. What was he doing? "He was talking to Mrs. Patterson from the general store," Ruth said, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "And do you know what Mrs. Patterson said about him?" Clara's stomach tightened. "What?" "She said that he was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, now that he's inherited half of the Thornwood Ranch. She said he was practically swimming in cattle and land." Ruth paused for effect. "And then he asked her if he could buy some of her goods on credit." "Credit! I thought men like him never worried about money." Clara's mind raced. Of course he had money. He owned half the damn territory now, didn't he? But something about the idea of him asking for credit, of him needing to barter for simple things like everyone else, caught her off guard. He wasn't untouchable after all. Not entirely. She forced her voice steady. "I guess he's like everyone else. Needs to pay his bills." Ruth gave her a skeptical look. "He doesn't need to, Clara. He could have paid cash for anything in this town and still had more than enough left over. But instead, he's asking for credit like a common ranch hand, like he's still one of them." Clara's chest tightened as she went back to kneading the dough. What was Ruth trying to say? That Jackson wasn't what he seemed? That somehow, despite everything he had, he was different? She shook her head, unwilling to entertain the thought any longer. "I'm sure he's just being polite," Clara muttered. "I don't know why this matters. It doesn't matter." Ruth's voice softened. "You know, I don't think he's like the others, Clara. Maybe he's someone you don't have to fight alone anymore." Clara's heart skipped. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to let anyone in, especially not some wealthy cowboy who had no idea what it meant to struggle. "Stop it, Ruth," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm not interested in whatever Jackson Callahan is offering. I'm trying to run a business here, and I don't need distractions." Ruth didn't argue. She simply stood up and grabbed a towel from the counter. "I'm just saying, Clara, you might want to think about it. Think about what he's really offering." The next day, the sun had barely risen when Clara heard the familiar sound of Jackson's wagon rumbling down the street. She didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The sound of Thunder's hooves had become a strange comfort to her over the past week, and though she tried to push it away, it was hard to ignore the fact that every time she heard that wagon, her heart seemed to race a little faster. She didn't want to care. She couldn't. But she was only human, and in that moment, with her hands covered in flour and the smell of fresh bread filling the air, Clara realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. The bell over the door chimed softly as Jackson stepped in. his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His hat was tipped low again, the way he always did it when he entered her shop. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice low but steady. Clara set down her mixing spoon, her heart beating loud in her ears. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," she replied, her voice colder than she felt. He hesitated for a moment, and then, with a half-smile that seemed almost apologetic, he spoke again. "I came to pick up the bread for the ranch, as agreed, but, I was wondering if you'd join me for lunch sometime. I've been meaning to apologize properly, for the other day." Clara's breath caught. She had no idea how to respond. Her instincts screamed at her to say no, to refuse and send him on his way, but there was something in his eyes, something that made it impossible to do so. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson's eyes softened, and he nodded. "Fair enough, but whenever you're ready, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm here." With that, he tipped his hat once more and left, the door closing gently behind him. Clara stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself she was just being foolish, that nothing would change. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. Clara didn't see Jackson again for 3 days after that morning. Life in Copper Springs didn't stop, and neither did she. Each day she woke with the sun, the smell of fresh bread filling her tiny bakery. She kept her head down, kept herself busy, just as she always had. But despite her best efforts, thoughts of Jackson Callahan kept creeping into her mind. She tried not to think about the way he'd looked at her, the quiet sincerity in his eyes when he'd apologized. She tried not to think about the way his voice had softened when he spoke of understanding her struggle. But no matter how much she baked, how many loaves of bread she shaped, the image of him lingered like a shadow. It was Ruth who finally brought him up again, as she always did when Clara least expected it. "Jackson was asking about you again today," Ruth said, setting down a basket of apples on the counter. "He's been by a few times this week, asking when you'll be ready to come out to the ranch for that lunch." Clara didn't look up from the dough she was working. "I told you, I'm not interested in whatever it is he's offering. I'm not looking for help. I'm just trying to keep this shop running." Ruth was quiet for a moment, and then, in that way she had of speaking when she knew something Clara didn't, she said, "He's not offering help, Clara. He's offering you a choice. A choice you haven't had in a long time." Clara's hands stilled in the dough, but she didn't look at Ruth. She could feel the weight of her words settling into her chest, heavy like the air before a storm. "I don't need to make any choices. I've already made mine. I'm here. This shop is here. That's all that matters." Ruth didn't push further. She simply let the silence hang between them, thick with unspoken things. The following morning, Clara was setting out her fresh loaves when she heard the familiar sound of Thunder's hooves again. Her heart fluttered, unwelcome and uninvited, and before she could stop herself, she looked up toward the door. Jackson was standing there, just like before, with his hat tipped low and that quiet, knowing look in his eyes. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he watched her for a moment, as though deciding something in his mind. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking, ma'am," he began, his voice soft. "You were right the other day. I came into your shop like I owned it, like it didn't matter to me if I broke something. I've been a bull in a china shop, and I owe you an apology for that, so I wanted to say it properly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell." Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she refused to let it show. She nodded stiffly, her gaze dropping to her hands, still covered in flour. "Apology accepted," she said, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. Jackson stood there, his amber eyes searching her face as if trying to gauge her reaction. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he spoke again. "I know you're a busy woman, and I know you've got no time for any more distractions in your life, but if you'll hear me out, I'll tell you what I'm offering." Clara's heart quickened, though she tried to ignore it. "What's that?" Jackson's expression softened, the faintest trace of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "A partnership," he said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Clara's brows furrowed. "A partnership," she repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "A partnership in your bakery," Jackson clarified. "You need security, Mrs. Mitchell. I can give you that. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering you an opportunity to expand, to grow, to have more than just this shop, more than just surviving, a real future. Clara felt the weight of his words, but something in her recoiled at the thought. A partnership with him, a man she barely knew? It felt too much like accepting pity, too much like giving up her hard-won independence. "I've made it this far on my own," she said firmly, finally meeting his gaze. "I don't need help. I don't need anyone." Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not here to make you feel like you need me. I'm here to give you a choice. A choice to stand on your own 2 feet without worrying about every little thing falling apart." Clara shook her head, though her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings she couldn't quite sort through. "I don't want your money. I don't need your land. I've built this bakery with my own 2 hands, and I intend to keep it that way." Jackson sighed, the frustration barely hidden behind the calm of his voice. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm offering to help you make this work. For you. For your daughter. You've done so much on your own already. Why not let someone stand beside you for once?" The words hit Clara harder than she expected, and for a moment she faltered. She had been alone for so long, fighting tooth and nail to keep her life together. It was easy to forget what it felt like to have someone on your side. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, feeling the walls she'd built around herself shake ever so slightly. Jackson nodded, tipping his hat once more. "You don't have to decide today, ma'am. I'll be back in a few days. But whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Clara watched him leave, the sound of Thunder's hooves slowly fading as he rode off into the distance. She spent the next few days in a daze, unable to shake the offer from her mind. It was maddening, the way Jackson Callahan had made her feel like something more than just a widow, more than just a baker struggling to make ends meet. The thought of a partnership, of building something with someone who wasn't trying to take everything from her, tugged at a part of her heart she hadn't realized was still alive. But she couldn't let it happen. She wouldn't let herself rely on anyone. Not again. As she closed up her shop late one evening, Clara heard a voice from the doorway. "Clara." She turned to see Jackson standing there, his figure silhouetted by the fading light. He looked different somehow, as if he had come to a decision of his own. "Jackson," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "What are you doing here?" "I'm not asking for anything, ma'am," he said quietly. "I just wanted to let you know I'm not giving up on this. On you." Clara swallowed, unsure of what to say. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she needed to understand. He stepped forward, just a little. "I'm here for you, if you want me to be." Clara didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The words Jackson had said, the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet promise that he wouldn't give up, kept spinning through her mind like a broken record. She wanted to be angry at him, wanted to push him away, but something in the way he looked at her made it hard to do either. The next morning, she was up before dawn, baking bread as usual. The rhythmic kneading of the dough was the only thing that calmed her racing thoughts. But even the familiar, comforting process of baking couldn't block out the fact that Jackson Callahan had managed to burrow into her mind, into her life, without even trying. And now, every time she heard Thunder's hooves outside her bakery, her heart skipped a beat, whether she wanted it to or not. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that it was just business. He was offering a partnership. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. But Clara knew that even she didn't believe that anymore. Around mid-morning, as Clara was putting a fresh batch of rolls on the counter, the door opened with its familiar chime. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The weight of his presence was impossible to ignore. Jackson Callahan. Of course. She didn't look at him right away. She kept her hands busy, smoothing the dough into perfect, soft rolls. But when she felt his eyes on her, steady and patient, she had to look up. There he stood, standing tall in the doorway, his usual quiet confidence there, though there was something softer about him today. His eyes held her gaze, and he stepped inside, as though he belonged. "I didn't come here for bread today, ma'am," Jackson said, his voice quiet, "though I'll take a loaf if you'll sell me one." Clara didn't speak, her fingers trembling slightly as she sliced the loaves with practiced ease. She placed a warm loaf of bread on the counter and reached for the price, but he stopped her with a quiet, "No need." She paused for a moment, meeting his eyes, still unsure what to make of him. "What do you want, Jackson?" He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting. "I want you to know something. I meant what I said. I'm here to help. No strings attached." Clara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck. "You've worked hard," he continued, his gaze steady. "I've seen it. I've watched you. I know how hard you've had to fight, just to keep this shop going. I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't sit by and watch you do it all alone anymore." Clara's heart skipped. She hated that the idea of not being alone sounded so tempting. She hated that a part of her wanted to reach out, to say yes, to let him in. But no, she couldn't. She couldn't let herself rely on anyone. Not again. Not after Thomas. "I don't need help," she said, more forcefully than she felt. "I've been doing fine on my own. I've been doing just fine." Jackson's eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like he was seeing something deeper in her than just the walls she'd built. "I know you have, but you don't have to do it alone." Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She needed to focus on what mattered. Her daughter, her bakery. Not on a man who could easily walk away when things got tough. "I'm fine, Jackson," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "I don't need you to fix things. I'm not some damsel in distress." He nodded, though there was no judgment in his gaze, just understanding. "I'm not trying to fix you, Clara. I'm trying to stand with you." Quote. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would shut him out, but for some reason, the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, feeling the weight of everything, her pride, her fears, her aching heart. She wanted to be strong, but sometimes, strength felt like the heaviest thing to carry. Jackson's voice broke through her thoughts, calm and steady. "I know you've been through hell, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm asking if you'll let me help. And if you say no, I'll walk out of here and never bring it up again. But if you say yes, I'll stay." Clara felt a sharp pang in her chest. He was offering something she couldn't quite name, but something real. And it terrified her. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. Jackson nodded, and for a moment his expression became almost unreadable. "I understand. Trust is earned. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I'm not like everyone else." Quote. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and in that moment, Clara realized something she hadn't been able to admit to herself until now. She didn't want to be alone anymore. As Jackson walked out the door, he left behind a single loaf of bread, the same one he'd asked for earlier. Clara stood in the quiet shop, her heart pounding in her chest, still unsure of what to do next. She wasn't ready to accept help. She wasn't ready to face the things Jackson was offering. Partnership, trust, maybe even more. But as she stared at the loaf of bread on the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was the weight of years spent alone, the weight of raising Lily without help, of carrying the burdens of her past. Maybe it was the quiet promise in Jackson's eyes that said he wouldn't give up on her, even when she couldn't bring herself to believe in him. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to feel something other than exhaustion. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was something close, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself, a hint of something she hadn't dared to dream of for so long. Later that afternoon, after the bakery had closed for the day, Clara sat with her daughter at the table, staring at the bread on the counter, her mind racing. She tried to focus on the simple joys. Lily's laughter, her bright eyes, the soft smile on her face when she took a bite of bread, but all she could think about was Jackson Callahan and the offer he had laid at her feet. "You okay, Mama?" Lily asked, looking up from her plate of food, her small brow furrowed in concern. Clara smiled, pushing aside the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. "Yeah, baby, I'm okay." And for a moment, just a moment, Clara allowed herself to believe it. She was okay, but in her heart she knew that things were changing. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, She couldn't stop the feeling that Jackson Callahan had already become a part of her life in ways she couldn't untangle. The trouble didn't arrive with noise. It came quiet. Clara was wiping down the counter near closing time when the air in the bakery shifted. Not colder, not louder, just wrong. Her hands slowed, her chest tightened. She had learned that feeling the hard way. Trouble didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited until your back was turned. The bell over the door rang. Clara looked up, expecting Ruth or a late customer. Instead, a man stood in the doorway she'd never seen before. He was thin, dressed clean despite the dust, with eyes that didn't settle on anything for long. Not the bread, not the counter, not her face. He smiled anyway. "Evening," he said. "You Clara Mitchell?" "Yes," she answered carefully. "We're closed." "That's all right." He stepped inside without asking. "Won't take but a minute." Clara felt her spine stiffen. "What do you want?" The man glanced around the shop, nodding like he approved of something. "Name's Ellis Crow. I work for folks who keep an interest in properties around Copper Springs." Her heart sank. "If this is about rent." "It's not." His smile widened, but his eyes stayed flat. "Not yet, anyway." Clara crossed her arms. "Then say what you came to say." Crow leaned a hand on the counter, close enough that she could smell tobacco on his breath. "Word is you've been getting friendly with Jackson Callahan." Clara didn't answer. Crow chuckled, didn't deny it. "That tells me enough. Mr. Callahan buys bread here, that's all." He nodded slowly. "Funny thing about Jackson. New money, big land. Makes people curious, makes others nervous." Clara's voice sharpened. "If you have a point, make it." Crow straightened. "Point is, some folks think you're getting ideas above your station. Think you might cause trouble for a man who's better off keeping peace." Clara felt anger flare hot and sudden. "You can tell those folks I mind my own business." "Oh, I will." His gaze flicked toward the back room. "Just wanted to be sure you understood how fragile things can be. Shops, leases, futures." A beat passed. Then he smiled again. "Have a good night, Mrs. Mitchell." He left as quietly as he came. Clara stood frozen long after the bell stopped ringing. Jackson arrived just after sunset. She saw him through the window first, talking to Lily outside, kneeling so he could listen properly, while she explained something with serious intensity. He laughed at something she said, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him as much as anyone else. Clara's chest tightened. When he stepped inside, he took one look at her face and stopped. "What happened?" She shook her head. "Nothing." Jackson didn't move. "That's a lie." She exhaled. "A man came by, said his name was Ellis Crow. He asked questions about you." Jackson's jaw set. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly." "That's a yes." She nodded. "He talked about rent, about fragile things." Jackson swore under his breath, low and controlled. "I should have known they'd start this way." "They?" He met her eyes. "The Sterlings." Clara's stomach dropped. "The bank family." "Yes." His voice hardened. "They don't like surprises. And they don't like losing control." "I didn't do anything," she said quietly. "I know." He stepped closer. "But you matter now. That makes you leverage." The word hit hard. "I don't want trouble," Clara said. "I just want to live." Jackson's voice softened. "And that's exactly why I won't let them touch you." She looked at him then. Really looked. The calm strength. The barely contained anger. The certainty. "You can't fight everyone," she said. "No," he nodded, "but I can stand my ground." The attack came 2 nights later. Clara was closing up when she heard shouting outside. Then, glass shattered. She screamed. A brick slammed through the front window, scattering shards across the floor. Lily cried out from the back room. Clara ran to her, heart pounding, lifting her into her arms. "Mama!" "It's all right," Clara said, though her voice shook. "Stay here." She peered through the broken window. 3 men stood across the street. One of them laughed. "You've been warned, Baker," a voice called out. "Next time won't be glass." Before Clara could move, a thunder of hooves tore down the street. "Jackson!" He rode straight at them, fury carved into his face. He didn't slow, didn't shout. He didn't need to. The men scattered. One tripped. Jackson dismounted in a blur, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against a post. "Who sent you?" Jackson demanded. The man laughed nervously. "You already know." Jackson's fist came close, stopped. "Get out of town," he said coldly. "And tell your employer this ends tonight." He let the man go. The fire started before dawn. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Not bread, smoke. She ran outside with Lily wrapped in a blanket. Flames licked at the neighboring building, heat roaring, men shouting as buckets were passed hand to hand. The wind shifted. Straight toward her bakery, Jackson appeared beside her, grabbing her shoulders. "You're leaving, now." "My shop can be rebuilt," he said. "You can't." A beam collapsed with a crack like thunder. Clara didn't argue. Jackson lifted Lily into a wagon, then turned back toward the fire without another word. Clara watched him disappear into smoke and chaos, her heart lodged in her throat. By morning, the fire was out. 2 buildings gone. Her bakery stood, blackened, scorched, but standing. Jackson was found near the well, collapsed, a bullet wound in his side. Alive, barely. Clara knelt beside him, gripping his hand as the doctor worked. Blood stained her dress. Tears blurred her vision. "You saved me," she whispered. Jackson's eyes fluttered open. "Didn't ruin everything this time," he murmured weakly. She laughed through sobs. "You're an idiot." "Maybe." His fingers tightened around hers. "But I'm not leaving." The days blurred together after the fire. Clara sat beside Jackson's bed, watching as the doctor worked, his hands steady, even as Jackson's wound throbbed with fever. The smell of herbs and antiseptic filled the room, mingling with the faint, comforting scent of fresh bread that still lingered in the air despite everything. Outside, Copper Springs was rebuilding, quietly, slowly. The fire hadn't spread as far as it could have, but it had still taken a piece of the town with it. Clara wasn't sure if the worst had passed yet, or if something darker still waited to show its face. She kept her eyes on Jackson, watching his chest rise and fall, the faint rasp of his breathing steadying as he finally drifted into a deeper sleep. It was terrifying how much she depended on him already, a man she hadn't even known a month ago. And yet here he was, lying in her bed, injured, fighting for his life, while she tried to figure out how to keep everything from crumbling beneath them. As she sat there, the door creaked open. Margaret Thornwood entered with a quiet knock, her face lined with the weight of the world. "Clara," she said, her voice softer than usual, "we need to talk." Clara nodded, carefully adjusting the pillow behind Jackson's head so he was more comfortable. "What is it?" quote. Margaret paused, taking a seat by the window where the light filtered through the dusty curtains, casting shadows on the floor. "Jackson won't stay in bed much longer. He'll want to get back to work soon." Clara felt a pang in her chest. She wasn't ready to face him being out of the house. Not when she could still feel the weight of the fear, the uncertainty. "Tell me," Margaret said, her eyes turning sharp as she studied Clara. "What are you going to do?" Clara blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" About the Sterlings, Margaret's words were a quiet punch. "This won't stop, Harold won't stop, and now that Jackson's involved," she trailed off. "He's made a target of himself, just like you, but there's one difference. He's got money, and he's got people willing to fight for him." "I can't just run," Clara whispered, as if the thought of abandoning everything she'd worked for, everything she loved, made her heart crack open. "I won't. This is my life. This is my daughter's future." Margaret's face softened, but there was still that steel in her eyes. "I know, child. I know you're strong. But sometimes strength doesn't win against men like Harold Sterling. Sometimes it takes more." Clara's throat tightened, but she swallowed, fighting back the flood of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Jackson wants to fight. He won't back down." Margaret nodded slowly, the look in her eyes almost tender. "Then we'll fight with him." Quote. It was late afternoon when Jackson woke again, his fever finally broken. Clara was sitting beside him when his eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his expression tired but not broken. "I told you I wasn't leaving," he said quietly. voice hoarse from the fever and exhaustion. Clara smiled softly, reaching out to gently brush his hair from his forehead. "You're impossible," she whispered. He chuckled, but it was weak. "You're one to talk." For a long moment, they just sat there, his hand in hers, no words needed. And for a while, Clara let herself forget about everything. About the Sterlings, about the threats, the broken window, the fire. She let herself focus only on him, on the warmth of his hand in hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Finally, Jackson spoke again, his voice low. "What happens now?" Clara's chest tightened, but she met his eyes, her jaw setting with determination. "We make sure they can't hurt us anymore." "Clara," Jackson said, his voice serious, "if we're going to do this, we need to be ready. We need to make sure you and Lily are safe. I won't let anything happen to you." She squeezed his hand, the bond between them more tangible than ever. "I don't need you to protect me, Jackson," she said, her voice fierce. "I need you to stand with me." He smiled, though it was faint. "That's all I've ever wanted." The next day, they began preparing. The word was spreading fast, and they had no intention of letting Harold Sterling have the final word. Clara contacted people she knew, ranchers, families, store owners, and together they began organizing. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They couldn't fight Sterling alone, but they didn't have to. As the days wore on, Jackson's strength returned, and with it came the steady rhythm of a new life, a life where they weren't just surviving, but choosing to live, to fight. Clara stood in front of the bakery one evening, looking at the sun setting over the town, the last light of the day casting long shadows on the streets. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she wasn't facing it alone, and that was enough for her. By the time the sheriff arrived with the news of Sterling's defeat, Copper Springs was already changing. The town wasn't just the place people came to for business. It was home. Home to Clara, Jackson, and Lily. Home to the people who refused to let fear dictate their lives. Clara didn't care about the gossip anymore. She didn't care about the sneers from the women who whispered behind her back. All she cared about was the man at her side and the daughter asleep in the other room. And when the sheriff made his announcement, Clara wasn't surprised. She didn't need a victory to know they had already won. Sterling's empire had crumbled, but their family, their love, it was built to last. Later that evening, after the storm had passed, Jackson found Clara outside on the porch, looking at the stars. She hadn't even heard him approach. "What's on your mind, Mrs. Callahan?" he asked softly, leaning beside her. Clara turned to him, smiling through her tears. "Everything," she said quietly. "Everything I never thought I deserved." Quote, "You deserved every bit of it," Jackson replied, his voice warm, sure, and more. She rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes closing as she took in the night, the quiet. "We'll make it," Clara whispered. "Together." Jackson kissed the top of her head, pulling her closer, as the stars above them burned a little brighter, just like their future.